Hey everybody, and welcome back to our sixth installment of our church history class. Today we'll be exploring the persons and the events surrounding another outbreak of heresy in the ancient church. We'll be talking about Cyril of Alexandria and Pelagius. So thanks for joining us once again. By the way, a very happy and blessed All Saints' Day to all of you out there. God be praised for this day where we remember all of the departed faithful that have gone before us to be comforted by Christ in heaven. According to Revelation chapter 7, we have a beautiful image there that every tear will be wiped away from their eyes. So until that great reunion on the last day, when all of the dead will be raised and reunited around the throne of Christ, we wait in great anticipation, and we also give thanks for those who have gone before us. Now, Cyril and Nestorius, you remember last time the dispute had to do with salvation. How are we saved? You remember that Pelagius said that basically it's according to our works as we conform ourselves to the example of Christ. However, we learned from St. Augustine that no, God saves us according to his grace. This dispute, however, has to do with Christ's person. It has to do with his person. That is how the divinity and his humanity relate together. So, without any further ado, Cyril and Nestorius. Remember, the two different cities in the Christian East had two different emphases when it came to the person of Christ. There's Antioch up there, close to Syria, right on this armpit of Asia Minor, right in the Levant. They emphasized up in Antioch the humanity of Christ. And it is said, according to the scholars, that they read their Bibles more literally than the Alexandrian school of biblical interpretation, which was started by Origen, and they had kind of a crazy time with allegorical interpretation. But the main thing here is that for Antioch, they wanted to emphasize the true humanity of Christ. And in Alexandria, on the other hand, they wanted to emphasize the unity of Christ's person, and that the humanity was in fact glorified through the divinity, through the Logos that became flesh, as we read about in John chapter 1. Now, invariably, as you can imagine, this is going to result in some tension and fighting, and there are extremes on both sides of this, right? So for the Antiochian school, you can imagine that the extreme would be Nestorianism, and we're going to hear all about that. And of course, on the Alexandrian side, the extreme, we would say, would be Eutychianism. And they're both named after their respective fathers of those particular heresies. So let's get into it. All right, Nestorius was born in Syria, and we're not exactly sure of the date. And he died in exile in Upper Egypt in the year 451, never properly repenting of his teachings that were contrary to the rule of faith. He lived in exile and died in exile at the end of his life. But this guy is no small-time friar in some faraway village that doesn't matter, right? You remember yesterday being Reformation Day that Martin Luther was a Augustinian friar in faraway Wittenberg, and he nailed 95 Theses to the church door there. And it seems like a kind of a stretch that somebody off in Wittenberg would cause such problems for the church in Rome, right? Well, it turns out that Nestorius had a very high and important position. He was the bishop of Constantinople, the patriarch, and he was appointed to that position by the Emperor Theodosius II himself in 428. And at that point, he showed himself to be a very great enemy against all of the heretics, right? So he attacked the heresies of the Arians and the Novatians and all these other heretics that were plaguing the church, and he set up chapels there in Constantinople and elsewhere throughout the Eastern Empire. But this is significant. He refused to cast off a group of Pelagian refugees from the West. Instead, he gave them shelter, and he sympathized with their cause. In 429, in a sermon, picking up on some of the preaching and the teaching of his Antiochian colleagues, he attacked the term that had been widely used in this part of the world by now, that had come from Alexandrian theology, that Mary is in fact Theotokos. What does this mean? Theotokos means the mother of God, the mother of God. He attacked this term. He says that's not right. She is not the mother of God. God does not have a mother by definition. Therefore, it's more proper to say that Mary is Theotokristos, or how did he say it? Theotokokristos, or something like this. She is the bearer of Christ. Now, Nestorius, in preaching like this, like I said, he kind of picked up on this and ran with some of the words and the exchanges that he had picked up from his colleagues in the Antiochian Christological school. But as soon as the Alexandrians, who had most of the power and the money in the empire at this time, heard about this, their bishop in Alexandria, Cyril, was soon engaged and embroiled in the dispute. And he said, take it back. Say that Mary is the mother of God. We know that this is true. Otherwise, we don't truly believe that the Word became flesh, the eternal Word of God that has been with the Father from eternity. Now, why does Theotokos matter to Cyril? Well, it matters for this reason. This is a summary by Julio Gonzalez, who wrote the History of Christian Thought, as I've mentioned before. Mary is the mother of God, not because the divinity of Christ began to exist in her, which would be absurd. That's like the second person of the Trinity didn't exist until Christmas, right? That's not what we're saying. But because she is the mother of a humanity that subsists only by its union to the Word, and of which one must therefore say that all its predicates are to be applied to that Word. Therefore, it is necessary to affirm not only that God was born of a virgin, but also that God walked in Galilee, suffered and died, and was born of the Virgin Mary. You see? Otherwise, what we're saying is something less than the Scriptures want to describe in the high and beautiful theology of the apostles, especially in John chapter 1, right? So to say that Mary is the mother of Christ and refuse to say that Mary is the mother of God, we're saying something about the Logos, right, that became flesh in her womb and was born of her. So Cyril, a little bit about him. He became bishop in Alexandria in 412, and he championed Alexandrian Christology. He was seen by modern scholars and by his contemporaries as being an ambitious, vain, power-hungry individual, and he was willing to use politics and money to achieve his ends. However, Cyril of Alexandria does also have some sympathizers and apologists who say the man was just very, very committed to Orthodox Christianity and a proper biblical understanding of who Christ is, and for that he was justified his use of courtly politics, especially in trying to sway the emperor, and in using money even to make sure that the arguments went his way. He used this phrase, one incarnate nature of the divine Logos. He was trying to emphasize the unity of Christ, the human and the divine together, that you can't speak of Christ as if he's man one moment and God, and it appears as God the other, but like both the human things and the divine things must be predicated of Christ, right? Now that particular phrase, one incarnate nature of the divine Logos, was adopted unwittingly from Apollinarius. And do you remember his particular heresy that the divine and the human were united by virtue of the Logos occupying the place of a human spirit, right, in the human nature? Now, Cyril didn't want to appropriate any heresy or bad theology. He thought that this phrase had in fact come from Athanasius. He didn't know that it came from Apollinarius, and so he understood it not as Apollinarius did, but instead rather in an Orthodox Christian way, and he used it to good effect. This is according to Walker. Of course, we've been using his History of the Christian Church. For Cyril, what this phrase, not to mention the Creed of Nicaea, was saying was that in Christ there is one subject, one nature or hypostasis, that of the divine Logos, and that the humanity of Christ, body and soul, right? He's not Apollinaris, was the mode of existence by which the Logos had made his own through his birth of a woman, through his birth. That's a typo. Forgive me. The humanity, in other words, could in no way be separated from the Logos as another beside him, right? There's no way to conceive of Jesus the man apart from the Logos, you see. The humanity of Christ is not something that could be abstracted apart from the Word, because the Word has been made man, right, in the Virgin's womb. So he also uses this language to develop what becomes pretty common in today's theological parlance, that there's a union in hypostasis, or rather there's a personal union of the divine and the human natures. They're united in the person of Christ. You hear a lot of pastors, theologians, seminarians, professors saying that. Okay, so Cyril, in seeing Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, running in this direction that abstracts an understanding of Christ's humanity apart from the Logos, he enlists the support of the Roman Pope Celestine I. That's a picture of him right there. At a synod in Rome in 430, Nestorius was ordered to recant. He was sent a series of anathemas that he was supposed to sign on to. But of course, Nestorius, being the Patriarch of Constantinople, sent a return barrage of anathemas. They're like cannon blasts for church fighting. Anathemas. Trent did the same thing against the Lutherans, folks. That's how it goes. The Lutherans, interestingly enough, when they do anathemas, they never address them to a person. They only anathematize various articulations of theology. Okay, so the general, I think it was, which theologian makes this point? If I remember, I'll let you guys know. So a general council was summoned for 431 to settle this particular dispute, because the synod in Rome had caused such an uproar. You know, the emperor in the East realized that, hey, this can't stand. We got to get all the churches together to settle this. We can't have Rome and Alexandria against Constantinople. Now, when this council was convening, I believe it was in Ephesus, the Nestorian supporters didn't arrive on time. This is where people see Cyril's power hungriness or something like this come through. So Cyril's like, well, they're not here. My party's here, so let's convene the council. And in like 3 hours, basically in an afternoon or something like this, Cyril had condemned and deposed Nestorius and had rejected his doctrine. And they also, this is significant, this is the concession to Rome, right, for their support. They condemned Pelagianism. The Nestorians several days later arrived late, but they convened their own sort of anti-council, and they condemned Cyril and his party. And so what happened was that the emperor basically threw everybody into confinement until Cyril was able to convince the emperor to go against the Nestorians. At that point, work was done towards a formula of reunion to reconcile Alexandria and Rome with Antioch. And as a part of this formula of reunion, they were able to convince the Antiochians to not throw out the term Theotokos, but rather to affirm it. But, and here's the important part, Cyril and the Alexandrian school also had to affirm the union of two distinct natures. That it's not like some third hybrid thing had happened in the person of Christ, but instead he is distinctly a man and distinctly God, right? And to Cyril's credit and to the Alexandrians' credit, they said, yes, we'll go along with this. We'll bend here. We'll make sure that our language reflects this. Now, after this point, some of the Alexandrians refused to go along with the insistence on the two natures, even though I would say that most of them did. This one particular guy named Eutychus soon taught that Christ's humanity is of the same substance as ours, and that there were two natures only before the incarnation. What does that mean? That at the beginning there's like humanity and divinity, but in the incarnation there's like a sublimation of the two into something else. And of course this goes against the formula of reunion. And it means that when we speak of Christ now, it's not correct to say that he is co-substantial with humanity. He's not, according to Eutychus. So Leo's tome was Leo the Pope in Rome at this point. He can reference back to the old baptismal formulations and articulations that were used in the West to help basically dissuade Eutychus from articulating his Christology in that way, which spoke about the unity of Christ at the expense of the distinction and the reality of the divinity and the humanity, right? And he also, in his tome, spoke against Nestorianism, which kept the divinity and the humanity abstracted and separate from one another. And so at a council in Ephesus in 449, bad things happened. This was like hyper-Alexandrian. Eutychus was vindicated, Leo's tome was rejected, and this ruptured any hope of union between Alexandria and Rome. They kind of were set against each other at that point, became enemies. Leo's tome, however, helped articulations of Christology in the definition of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So two natures united in the person, like these Latinish terms. This comes because of the contribution of Leo's tome. Nevertheless, the Nestorians established their own churches in places like Armenia and in Persia. They were known as the Jacobite Church. And until the Arabs, of course, rolled through in the Muslim invasions, they were fairly popular out there in those eastern areas and northeastern areas. The one nature extremism of Alexandria resulted in what we would call monophysitism, and that still exists to this day among the Copts in Egypt. According to many of the scholars who are out there, Nestorius' true error is that he spoke of the human person of Christ in independent terms, as if the human Jesus could be conceived of apart from the Word or the Logos. That you could think of the humanity as such, right? And his language also, when he tried to describe it, he talked about two distinct persona that were united into two distinct prosopa that were united into a single prosopon. And that language probably confuses our confession of who Christ is rather than clarifies it. And also, this is, I think, significant. He pridefully refused to bend to better suggestions and better articulations, unlike Cyril, who, when he was forced with, hey, look, we'll keep Theotokos, right, in the formula of reunion, but you have to acknowledge the two natures of Christ. Cyril bent and said, yes, of course we do. He acknowledged that this is biblical, godly, and true, right? Now, what about the Monophysites? They refused to accept the Nestorian language, they would say, of the Council of Chalcedon, that the two natures, the two distinct natures language they found very, very uncomfortable. They said that this is new, that we were always considered orthodox without having to use a new articulation of language. We just want to go along with our older articulation of language and insist that there's one hypostasis. There's not more things going on in there. And so the unity of Christ is seen by the rest of the churches, by the Monophysites, is expressed at the expense of the confession of Christ's true humanity. And I think we can, and one of my good friends, Andrew Gerke, a pastor in Omaha, Nebraska, he certainly sympathizes with their insistence on maintaining older acceptable formulations of Christian doctrine before the heavy-handed impositions of the council. And they themselves, by the way, would say that they do not deny the humanity of Christ, right? So I'll leave it to you to maybe think about this, read a little bit more, and come to a conclusion as to the error of the Monophysites and how far it extends and how far separate from the Christian church they are. Like I said, if you talk to some of the Monophysites that are around today, they will, at least I had a brief conversation with one this past summer in Egypt, of course, and she insisted that she does believe in the humanity of Christ, but she rejects Roman. By Roman, she means Eastern Empire impositions of theology on their already tried and true articulations of theology in Egypt. So interesting. Now I think it's good for us to hear from Nestorius. This is a real picture of Nestorius wandering into the desert. No, just joking. I played around with some chat GPT stuff and got this pretty cool picture. So you can imagine Nestorius walking off into the desert on his own. But let's listen to Nestorius in his own words. A work of Nestorius that was composed late in his life while he was in exile in Egypt is the Bazaar of Heraclides. And here he tries to justify his use of language and his unwillingness to bend or to capitulate to Cyril and the Alexandrians. And so I just want to read a little bit to you from this. Nestorius writes, "Since then Christ called himself by the two names, both the apostles and the evangelists say also that he exists in two. He is both God, by whom everything comes about, and he came into the world, and he made the world, and he was not received by his servants, and to those who received him and believed in his name he gave authority to become the sons of God, and he became flesh and sojourned among us, he and none other. And since he became flesh and sojourned among us, he has drawn to himself the very flesh for the purpose of the adoption for his own prosopon, which is in both of them." Do you see? Okay, so remember the complaint about kind of abstracting the humanity of Christ as sort of distinct, even in the womb of Mary, as if the incarnation sort of found something inside Mary and then took it up, like an embryo or a baby or something like this. This is what makes, I think, the Alexandrians uncomfortable. In that, on the one hand, there is the ousia, or the being of God, but on the other, the flesh by the union and the adoption, in such wise that the flesh, which is flesh by nature, again, you have the humanity subsisting by itself kind of an idea, abstracted away from the divinity, is also son by the union and the adoption of the prosopon. Prosopon, by the way, is a Greek word meaning face or person. Or at this point in Greek history, I think that the prosopon actually might mean like an essence or something like this too. You Greek experts out there, remember this is a lay class. If you want to add some nuance or explanation, please be my guest, right? Nestorius continues, "Although he exists in both of them, yet he is called one Son and one flesh, and consequently the only begotten Son of God and the Son of Man. The same formed of both of them is predicated in both of them, because he has made the things of their prosopa." Remember, the two prosopa come together to make a prosopon. "His own prosopon, and is therefore acknowledged as his own prosopon, by the one as by the other. And he speaks with them now by virtue of the divinity, and now by virtue of the humanity, and now by virtue of both of them, as also the humanity used to speak now by virtue of the ousia of the humanity, and now by the prosopon of the divinity. On this account he both is the Son of God and the Son of Man, and has so spoken." That's difficult. So it's almost like for Nestorius, that sometimes Jesus is speaking according to the prosopa of the humanity, and then according to the prosopa of the divinity. You see, it's like two sides of a board. You get either one side or the other. And in fact, I think the scriptures speak not of the human Jesus and the divine Christ, but rather of Christ, the Word made flesh, right? So I have to acknowledge, Christ is true man, right? But it's always hard if we want to speak about him in these dualistic terms. It's always, I think, better to speak of Christ as one person, right? Otherwise, you fall into the trap of insinuating there's two persons. Now, Granted, Nestorius doesn't go there. He insists there's a singular prosopon, right? But in the way that he speaks about Christ, it's either one, the humanity, or the divine, the other, right? Okay, so let's now move on to Cyril in his own words. This is against the Nestorian rejection of the term Theotokos. Cyril writes, "Let them, therefore, not divide for us the one Son, setting the Word separate, and one Son apart, and separate from him, setting the man from a woman, as they say, but let them rather know that God the Word was not connected to a man, but is stated that he became man, succoring the offspring of Abraham, according to the Scriptures, and having been made like unto his brethren in all things, in one alone accepted," that is, he's without sin, right? "This likeness in every way he would properly have, and, above all other similarities, his birth from a woman, which in us is considered proper to human nature, and is like us. But in the only begotten it is perceived as going beyond us, for God was made flesh. Accordingly, the Holy Virgin is called Theotokos." The last two phrases there are the most important. That in the Holy Scriptures we confess that God, the eternal Logos, right, was made flesh. And so if we say that Christ was born of Mary, what we're saying is that the true God of heaven and earth was born of Mary. You understand? Now, philosophy and reason demand that the transient, finite flesh is incapable of predicating certain things of that flesh. It's improper and impossible to predicate divine things of that, right? So, nevertheless, right? This is what the mystery of the incarnation is. The second great mystery of the Christian Church, that God has become man in the person of Christ, is something that philosophy and reason must not dictate to or try to judge and adjudicate, but rather it is a biblical mystery that we hold fast to by faith alone, right? And so we should strive always to preserve the humanity of Christ as it's taught by the Scriptures and the true divinity of Christ, and to always insist that both the things that he does according to the divinity or according to the humanity is not done by the divinity alone or the humanity alone, but by Christ, right? So it's good and right to say that Christ suffered, right? That Christ hungered, that Christ is now even at the right hand of the Father, where only God is, you know. This is also what Cyril writes about what the Nestorians lose when they reject the uniting of the natures in the person of Christ, in the one hypostasis, as Cyril would say of Christ. "Therefore, an appearance of piety leads them away from the truth, because they do not perceive that his impassibility has been preserved insofar as he has divine existence and is God. But the suffering for us according to his flesh is also attributed to him insofar as, being God by nature, he became flesh, that is, a complete man. For who was he who said to God the Father in heaven, 'Sacrifice and oblation you would not, but a body you have fitted for me. In holocaust and sin offerings you have had no pleasure.'" Psalm 51. "Then I said, 'Behold, I come to do your will, O God.' For he who, as God, was without a body, says that the body was fitted to him so that, when he offered this for us, he might cure us all by his stripes." Isaiah chapter 53. "According to the saying of the prophet. But how is it that one died for all? One who is worth all others, if the suffering is considered simply that of some man." Remember this argument from Athanasius? That the divinity of Christ, the true, unvarnished, undiminished divinity of Christ is absolutely necessary if the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is to be efficacious for all sin and for all men. Amazing. "If he suffered according to his human nature," Cyril continues, "since he made the sufferings of his body his own, then indeed we say, and very rightly, that the death of him alone according to the flesh is known to be worth the life of all. not the death of one who is as we are, even though he became like unto us, but we say that he, being God by nature, became flesh and was made man according to the confession of the fathers. For if the statement that he suffered in his flesh is improper to him, that is, Christ, true God, suffered in the flesh, if we say that's improper to say about Christ, as Nestorius might be tempted to say, how is it not that which came before the suffering, that is, his birth according to the flesh, or even to speak out once and for all the manner of his becoming man? Thus the Christian mystery is gone, and the hope of salvation is henceforth rendered meaningless. Christology is everything, folks. If we mess around with Christology, we end up losing things like soteriology, which is our Christian articulations of salvation. Our C.F.W. Walther, the founder of the Missouri Synod, I mentioned this in a previous class, but it's good to mention it again. He makes a big deal about this, that God became man in the person of Christ. And so it's right for us to say, even, and this shocks some of our Protestant friends, that that truly God suffered and God died. And because it is divine blood that was shed upon the cross, it is holy and precious and efficacious for the salvation of the world. That's Good Friday preaching at its very best, friends. And I really hope that you have good pastors at home who preach boldly that the price that was paid upon the cross wasn't just that a good man died for us, right? But God became man so that the Son of God could suffer, die, and save us by his holy, precious blood and by his innocent suffering and death, right? The mystery of the Trinity is absolutely indisputable, or indispensable, I should say. The mystery of the incarnation is also indispensable for how we understand salvation. If God did not suffer and die for us in the person of Christ, then at best he's like some kind of moral exemplar. And you can see perhaps now why Nestorius was sympathetic towards the Pelagians and their cause, which taught salvation by striving after godliness by the virtue of their own dignified natures, let's say. All right, folks, that's all I have for you today on Cyril and Nestorius and Nestorianism. And if you have any comments or questions for me, please take advantage of the comment section underneath the video. If you have found this video helpful and informative, like and subscribe. If you found it very damaging for your sanity or other things, you can let me know that too, I suppose. But if you have any real questions, you should take it to your pastor. Just assume that I'm just some guy out there, a voice on the internet. Really, your pastor has the office in your own hometown, in your own home church, of preaching, teaching, and edifying you in your Christian faith. Until next time, God's peace be with you all.